Hi guys, hope you all doing well. Welcome back to our channel, and in this video we are going to talk about Microsoft Graph. Now since this will be the first video of the entire series that I will be creating for Microsoft Graph, I will try to make you guys conceptually understand what is the purpose of Microsoft Graph, why this product or why this service is designed. What is the purpose of Microsoft Graph API? What is the purpose of Microsoft Graph Explorer? And what kind of information can be queried by Microsoft Graph? Okay, so before we go ahead and understand how exactly a data-driven service works, what we have to understand that we are living in that era, or we are working in that era where everything depends upon data. It's all about data. Any application that you are using or that you are creating is going to consume some data or create some data on its own. That means the first fundamental behind any service to work is the data. The kind of data which your application can create, or the kind of data your application can query from different resources. Now, Microsoft Graph is the service which is designed to expose some sort of information which is available with M365, EMS, and Windows 10. This is the first line which you will read, or which is mentioned when you will try to read the documentation regarding Microsoft Graph, but I will explain you what exactly they mean by this. Okay, so when you will go and read Microsoft Graph documentation, the first statement which is mentioned is Microsoft Graph is a gateway to data and intelligence in M365. Okay, so this is the article which you can choose to begin with, and as you can see here, it is specifically mentioned that it provides a unified model that you can use to access the tremendous amount of data in Microsoft 365, Windows, and EMS. Okay, I'm going to explain you what exactly they mean by this. Okay, the next common statement that you guys might have heard is Microsoft Graph is a RESTful API to expose data over HTTPS. Now, any application, or in fact most of the application these days, everything is now secured, so the work on HTTPS. Okay, everything is secured, so the most preferred method of communicating over HTTP now is HTTPS itself. Okay, and the third common statement that you guys might have heard will be Microsoft Graph offers a Graph Explorer to query all the protected data. Now, the reason behind mentioning all the protected data, because Graph is something, Microsoft Graph is specifically something that's been protected by Azure AD. Now, I'm going to create a lot more videos for this, but since this is the first one, please try and understand the exact concept behind this Microsoft Graph API and Graph Explorer. Okay, let me begin with the easiest example which I can imagine, and that is, think about a scenario wherein you have a machine, and on that machine you have to access internet. Okay, the question comes, what is the first thing that you need? Okay, so that could be a medium. According to me, that means a LAN cable or a wireless connection that you can just connect to your machine and you have the internet access. Okay, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So as of now, there are three things which you can relate to from this particular deck. The first one is application. I may be using Google Chrome or Edge, any browser on my machine. And second thing is my machine needs an interface to actually connect to internet. Once the connection is there, I know a specific address that I have to reach, let's say Microsoft.com or Google.com or Facebook.com, any website, right? So basically, as of now, there are three different entities which are involved. The first one is application. The other one is interface that you will use to access a particular data. And the third and the most important thing is data itself. Okay. So when we talk about interface, we are clear. The concept is clear that yes, it's a medium that we are going to use to access a specific data. But according to me, what exactly data means is any information that exists and that can be queried by any medium is data. Okay, you can use application, you can use web browsers, there are websites, there are n number of ways of querying data, but the data should exist first, right? Now let's understand this from a service provider perspective, or how things work at the service side. Okay, the first fundamental of designing any application is that your application can be user driven or it cannot be user driven. When I say user driven, that means any task that is defined on your application has to begin with an authentication wherein the user identity is validated. And the other example is you have created a daemon service or some microservice that is querying all the set of information, building its own intelligence. Okay, so keeping things simple, or since we have already worked, I've showcased a lot more demos on the kind of applications which are user driven. Think about a scenario, your application needs some data for a user. Okay, but before a user can authenticate in your application, before you can access user information, there must be a user object that exists in a particular directory or that exists in a particular database. That means if as an admin I go to portal.azure.com and I create a user object, I am creating some sort of data. Okay, it's an object that's created in a database and it's a data which is available to be queried, right? Now once a user object is created, I can add this user object into a group. Now there are two ways to query the same data. I can go to portal.azure.com, I can click on user, I'll find my user. But if I'll click on group, I have to go to a particular group wherein this user exists as a member. But the moment I will click on member, I can again find this same user object. So that means what? First fundamental is data should exist, and the second process is how you should find that data. Now we have user, we have group. And as we move on with the deployment, I'm assigning different services to this particular user, or I'm assigning different licenses to this particular user. Now, to access any application, this user is going to use a device. That means the device which the user is using, it can be trusted or it cannot be trusted. Imagine a scenario wherein this user is using either a hybrid Azure AD joined machine or a compliant machine. That is something which is known to my directory. That means again there will be a device object that exists in my directory. So as you can see, the more we move on towards service provisioning, or the more we move on towards deployment, more and more data is getting generated, right? Now let's say this user is trying to use any of the trusted device that exists in my directory to access a particular application, and let's say that is Exchange. Okay, so what will be the scenario now? Though we have user object, we have group, we have devices, I can query all these three, but I can also query some of the related data. What do I mean by this? That when the user tried signing in, there will be a sign in activity, right? That exists in my Azure AD. That is also something which I can query. That means again there is some more information of data which is saved, right? Apart from this, we were only talking about Azure AD, but the fact is that, think about like this. When the user is trying to access a mailbox or Exchange service, there must be a mailbox object as well, right? And we can query that information as well. And then let's say this particular user has just received a simple Teams meeting or any calendar invite, right? Now that invite itself is an object, okay? Or that particular data also contains some attribute which can be checked. Likewise, the meeting which I have received as a user, who all are there as attendees, or give me the list of the participants of the meeting that I have just received, right? Now just think about the kind of data which is getting generated with even one single instance of your authentication request which is reaching Azure AD. So the first set of data which you have to understand is the object or resource itself. That means when I create a user object, I can query that from PowerShell. I can have a custom application that is going to query users, or I can have a service to build intelligence that will keep on querying all the users of my Azure AD without any user interaction, right? Now, object or resource specific here, they are two different terms, but they refer to the same entity. Now, when I am creating a user in Azure AD, it's an object for Azure AD. But when any application is trying to access that particular user object, it's a resource for that. Okay, so object and resource, they refer to the same entity. In a nutshell, that is the object which is created in Azure AD or any of the service. Okay, now since we got an idea that there will be too much information that's available which is only object specific, now just think about the scenario wherein all these objects, they work in conjunction. Now what do I mean by this? That let's say a user who is a member of this particular group is allowed to access Exchange if he is coming from a hybrid device. Now, as of now, this is something which is not being queried. There are four different entities which were queried, but the fact is that Azure AD is going to have a sign-in log. Now, all this I'm explaining is to give you an idea the kind of data that exists as of now and the kind of data which is already available, which you can use to inject in your application and create more sophisticated solutions. As of now, you see only 6 entities on this particular screen. But think about if we combine everything that exists for M365 or EMS or Windows 10. Okay. Now there is not immense amount of data which has been sent by endpoints, but still there is some data that exists and which you can use from a consumption perspective. Okay. So this security section that you see here is actually referring to WDADP, the endpoint protection, which is available on a device, which pumps in some information to Microsoft Security and Intelligence Graph. Okay. Now think about the entire data which is getting generated when these objects are working in conjunction. And one more fact here which I would like to address is that if you guys have observed, we have multiple portals to manage these entities, right? We have portal.azure.com, we have endpoint.microsoft.com, we have WDATP portal, and we have portal.office.com, wherein multiple admin centers are already linked. But what you have to understand that all these portals, these are all applications. That means these are all websites, right? It's not portal.office.com which is holding the user object. The fact is that it is querying a particular database. Okay. Now just for 5 minutes, imagine if all this would have existed in one particular container and you have to reach the interface of this particular container, then you have to give the address of the object that you want to query, and that's it. You have that information. Now, what do I mean by this? That if you want to query, let's say, mailbox information, you just have to come at the interface of this particular box. If you have to query some alerts which are generated by Windows Defender, you have to just come to this particular interface of this container. Or if you want to query some information related to device, group, or user, okay, you have to just come to this particular interface. That means the interface is common now for all the entities or for all kind of data which is as of now exposed by Microsoft. Now the reason behind emphasizing on exposed a lot more times, because see, in the cloud world, the way service provider works, the way they keep on changing things is something which is completely dependent on them. So there could be some information which is as of now available with Graph, which may not be available in future. There could be some information that is available not right now, but it may available in the future. Okay, it may be available in the future. Yeah. So the fact is that think about a scenario wherein the container has, this entire container has one single interface, and let's give that interface a name. Let's name it as graph.microsoft.com/v1.0. Just refer v1.0 as a version. Okay. Now think about a scenario, the same scenario which we were discussing before, that I want to query device, group, or user. Okay. As I've said before, that your request should land up to this particular interface, and then you should know the address where you have to reach. Okay. So let's say it could be devices at the end to access device information. It could be users at the end to access user information, and it could be group to access group information, right? So if I go to Graph Explorer as of now, okay, I'll explain this in a lot more detail, but just see this address. It's graph.microsoft.com v1.0 groups. If I'll click on run query, I'll get the query result of all the groups that exist in my directory. Okay. If I say users, I'll get all my users. If I'll say groups, I'll get groups again. If I'll say devices, okay, I'll get a list of devices. Okay, so in a nutshell, if your application can query this particular API or this particular address with the predefined methods, you can get all this information injected in your application. And we will reach this stage in this particular playlist itself. So as of now, if we just go back to what we were referring before, any object or any kind of data that has been exposed by Microsoft Graph, it should have a link address, or it should have a URI as graph.microsoft.com / v1.0 and then the entity type category. Okay. Now, if you remember the example with which we started, that you need a box, you need an interface, and you need internet connectivity to actually go ahead and check some data, right? So anything that exists as of now in M365, EMS, and Win10 when it comes to the log collection or when it comes to the sort of data which has been exposed can be queried by Microsoft Graph. Okay, but in a nutshell, all the data that can be queried, replace that with internet. That means you know as of now the address that you have to reach, okay, or the device type or the entity type that you have to reach. Let's say I want to query the sign-in logs of Azure AD. I have a reference point where I have to reach. But the fact is that to reach that particular web page or to reach that particular entity type, I need an interface. And this graph.microsoft.com / v1.0 is the API which is available for you to query all the data which is exposed by Microsoft. And then you can have a specific application that you will be using to query all this information, right? And in my previous examples, when we were talking about protocols, I have showcased this with Postman. But I'm pretty much sure that you're not learning Microsoft Graph to use Postman. You must be coding your own application that you will be using to access this particular information. So now imagine your application as a particular box that is going to query some information or that needs some information, some data that exists in M365 EMS or Win10. But to reach that data, you need an interface, you need an API. Okay, and that API is graph.microsoft.com / v1.0 as of now. There is a beta version as well, but as of now, Microsoft recommends to use v1.0 for production use. Okay, so the first image that we were talking about is your database, the entire data that can be queried. The next set of information is API, which will be this one, which is graph.microsoft.com / v1.0. And then you have your app, that means client and SDKs that are available. But there is one more thing which I would like to show you guys, and that is this Graph Explorer. This is technically an application which is actually querying graph information, or which is actually querying the data which is exposed with Graph API. In the next video, I will explain this in a lot more detail, but to keep this Graph Explorer in the reference point of our deck, just imagine this part of Graph Explorer exists here. So Microsoft Graph in a nutshell has three different components. The first one is that the entire data that can be queried, which is made available to you or for public through an API, which is graph.microsoft.com/1.0. And then you have a Graph Explorer, an application available as well that you can choose to begin with learning Microsoft Graph. Okay. Now, if you guys remember the three statements that I mentioned on a first slide of what is Microsoft Graph, the first statement was Microsoft Graph is a gateway to data and intelligence in M365. That means, again, all the data that exists is available to you up to a certain limit. Then Microsoft Graph is a RESTful API to expose data over HTTPS. The Graph Explorer that I have used as of now is going to HTTPS API. And again, everything nowadays is secured. So every link that you access, you'll find mostly it will be HTTPS. Now there's one more word which is mentioned here, and that is RESTful API. Now, as I said before, that REST is a standard which is defined. It is a specific architectural design which is there, which is available as a public information for designing hypermedia distributed systems. But this is something which I will cover in a lot more detail. As of now, just keep this as a reference point that if someone says, or if you read somewhere that graph.microsoft.com/v1.0, the first thought in your mind should be it is a data API which I will use to access some sort of information that I will inject in my application. And the third section itself is Microsoft Graph offers Graph Explorer for you to access all the protected data for M365, EMS, and Windows 10. Now, the reason behind mentioning protected data, because as of now, I'm already signed in with my global admin. That's why I'm getting all this information, but I will explain the purpose of all these settings which are available. So this was all about knowing very basics of Microsoft Graph from where you should begin with. And let's talk about a quick summary of what all we have discussed. So we have discussed about what is Microsoft Graph, what is Microsoft Graph API, what is Graph Explorer, the application that can be used, and what kind of data is available as of now to be queried by Microsoft Graph. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to begin with Microsoft Graph Explorer, how to make yourself comfortable with endpoints that you can reach for a specific API, how you should check which group should have what kind of endpoint, or which entity type should have what kind of endpoint that can be queried to get some sort of information. So if you guys have learned something new, please feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.